Well, thank you everyone for joining us. My name's Charity Anderson. I'm in the philosophy department here, and I'm just here to do introductions. So our first speaker this afternoon is Robert C. Roberts, former professor here at Baylor in the philosophy department. We're really pleased to have him. Dr. Roberts retired from Baylor in 2015, and before that, he had worked at a number of universities, including Wheaton, for roughly 16 years. His career has been preoccupied with looking at the relationship between emotions and virtuous character traits. And his most recent book, which came out this year, was called Recovering Christian Character, The Psychological Wisdom of Søren Kierkegaard. His talk is titled Artworks and the Increase of Christian Wisdom. And the way we're going to set up the session is we will have him speak, and then we'll do Q&A on his talk, and then I'll introduce Dr. Thomas Ward. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Roberts.
Thank you, Charity. St. Peter tells us in the first chapter of his second letter that the one who called us through the knowledge of his glory and virtue has given us everything we need for life and godliness. By knowing the attractions of such a glorious and virtuous God, by our appetite for his appeal, we can escape the corruption we live in the midst of and participate in the divine nature. Peter seems to be saying that by knowing God, we can share in God's virtues, that the knowing somehow causes the sharing. This appetitive knowing implies what we might call appreciation. To know a being that is gloriously virtuous without being enraptured is a pretty poor kind of knowing. So Peter goes on to warn that some knowledge of Jesus Christ is ineffectual and unfruitful. Not just any kind of knowledge of God will shield us from the surrounding corruption or enable us to participate in the divine nature. For this very reason, says Peter, you must make every effort to support your faith with virtue, and virtue with understanding, and understanding with self-control, and self-control with endurance, and endurance with godliness, and godliness with mutual affection, and mutual affection with love. Knowledge of God that's abstracted from such qualities of character, says Peter, is short-sighted and blind, and is forgetful of the cleansing of one's past sins. In a sense, it even fails to be knowledge. To the end of helping his fellow Christians acquire and maintain deeper and more effective knowledge of God, Peter says, I intend to keep on reminding you of these things, though you know them already and are established in the truth that has come to you. I think it right, as long as I am in this body, to refresh your memory, and I will make every effort so that after my departure, you may be able at any time to recall these things. The question of this talk is whether works of fine art can function as such reminders of the knowledge of God, and thus contribute to the deepening of that knowledge and the enhancement of such traits of Christian character as generosity, compassion, forgivingness, patience, self-control, and joy. Such reminders would whet our appetite anew, enhancing our sensitivity to the attractions of God's glory and virtue. Let's begin by reflecting about the nature and power of reminders. You can't be reminded of something without its having been already tucked away somewhere in your mind. Peter notes that his readers already know and are established in the truth of what he will remind them about. Christians are big users of reminders. When we say the creed every week, Most of us don't acquire any new information, and much of what we hear in sermons is review. For most of us, the substantial parts of the worship service are nothing but reminders of what we know already. It's a repeated theme in the teaching of Jesus and Paul that what we think about, including, I think, the way we think about it, gives shape to our character. When Peter compassionately tries to persuade Jesus not to walk into the jaws of rejection and death, Jesus notes Peter's resemblance to Satan and chides him for setting his mind on things human rather than things divine. And the word setting the mind there is phronein. Think about. Paul uses the same thinking verb when he says that those who exist according to the flesh set their minds on the things of the flesh, but those who exist according to the Spirit set their minds on the things of the Spirit. And, using a different verb, logizesthai, he recommends that the Philippians think about whatever is true, honorable, just, pure, pleasing, commendable, virtuous, or worthy of praise. Paul proposes these acts of thought, these acts of attention, as means of retaining Christian maturity and growing in its ways. These texts seem to be of a piece with the text from Peter with which we began. Peter will call back to the attention of his flock the knowledge of God that is sufficient for their life and godliness, that they may set their minds again on what they know of God. And as they do so, they may grow in virtues such as Peter mentions, and thus in Christian wisdom. Artworks are attention getters. They draw and hold our attention, largely by their beauty, I think, but also by being interesting, even when they are not beautiful. We gladly or compulsively set our minds on them, and thus on what they are about, if they're about anything. In one sense, we may gain no new knowledge by attention to great art, yet it may subtly change our understanding of that knowledge, potentially for the better, yielding a new insight, an insight that may become a more or less permanent feature of our moral infrastructure. Some reminders are uninformative. When I set my iPhone to alert me to take the bread out of the oven, the reminder doesn't deepen my understanding of anything. But when I meet a long-lost cousin in his old age, and his face and mannerisms remind me of the grandfather I last saw in the 1950s, I think the reminder might give me insight into my grandfather's face and into my cousin's face, and maybe into my own face. And experiencing these faces in this new reminding light, I may come to understand them, the people, a bit better, and to think in a fresh way of remembered episodes in their history. So many connections, however elusive they might be, pollinate one another. Such understanding may be ineffable. I struggle with only the most limited of success to articulate it, yet surely it is a kind of understanding, and thus a kind of knowledge. I suggest that reminders come roughly in two kinds. Corresponding to these two examples, the timer on the iPhone is an extrinsic reminder, while the play on the face of my old cousin and his gestural and vocal mannerisms are an intrinsic reminder of our grandfather. The latter reminders participate in the original knowledge in some deeply essential and analogical way, and for this reason can inform the knowledge with fresh understanding. The reminder is not just a repetition of the original knowledge, nor an external trigger connected to it by a convention, To be intrinsically reminded of something by something is a kind of understanding, a connecting, an integration. It involves grasping the analogy or other internal connection of the two things. It provides a new angle on the already known. It enriches the knowledge by extending the understanding. What is this knowledge of God that works of fine art might remind us of? We can think of knowledge as coming in four interrelated kinds. There's information, there's understanding, there's experiential acquaintance, and there's know-how. Most of us know that water is H2O. This is information. But most of us have only a superficial understanding of this information. For example, we have little understanding of how the hydrogen molecules bind to the oxygen molecule, or how solids can dissolve in H2O or be suspended in it. But we do have another kind of knowledge, of understanding, a practical understanding. After a little experience, we understand water's behavior intuitively. We understand how liquid water will slosh and won't stay in an open vessel if you turn it upside down. We understand that if you're in water, you need to stick your head out to breathe. We may know how to move our limbs in a way that propels us through the H2O. These are examples of know-how with water, and this know-how is also a kind of understanding, a largely intuitive, precognitive understanding. This practical understanding of water is all tied up with our experience of water, our sense of what it feels like to be wet, to be buffeted by a current, to see the gleaming sunlight on a lake in various conditions of wind and calm, and so forth. This is experiential acquaintance, and it also typically has an integrative character of understanding. Our knowledge of God, too, comes in these four kinds. We might think of the creed or the catechism as a summary of theological information. It's the facts, the basic truths. Christians tend to know what's in the creed. But it's another matter to understand it, to see the implications, to appreciate the connections among the parts of the information, and to put the aspects of that information together with ourselves and our relationships and with the world and our history, both individual and communal. Such understanding is experiential and practical. We may not only know that the Holy Spirit of Jesus has a certain character, that he is compassionate and forgiving and generous and patient and holy, but we may know by experiential acquaintance what it is to be on the receiving end of Jesus' love, and to bear these fruits, to wear these qualities, to walk the paths that he has hewn for us. And we may have this acquaintance by virtue of a know-how, an intuitive, ineffable, practical sense of how life goes when it goes in him, an ability to make our lives go that way. We may know how to swim in the medium of God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. In the summary I've just given, understanding bulks especially large and fundamental. The Christian will want to go beyond the mere factual knowledge of the catechism or creed. Christian knowledge that stalled there would surely count as ineffectual and unfruitful. Theological understanding, experiential acquaintance, and Christian know-how are all species of understanding. I think Peter has something like this in mind when he speaks of knowledge that is effective and fruitful. My question is whether works of fine art, of literature, painting, and music can contribute importantly to the deepening of Christian understanding. And if they can, I would like to know how they do it. The possibility that I especially want to examine is that artworks might function as reminders of what we already know and play a role in our becoming wiser. Alistair MacIntyre writes, when the Catholic Mass becomes a genre available for concert performance by Protestants, when we listen to the scripture because of what Bach wrote rather than because of what St. Matthew wrote, then sacred texts are being preserved in a form in which the traditional links with belief have been broken, even in some measure for those who still count themselves as believers. It is not, of course, that there is no link with belief. You cannot simply detach the music of Bach or even of Handel from the Christian religion, but a traditional distinction between the religious and the aesthetic has been blurred. MacIntyre writes of a link and a distinction. The link is between the text of the Mass and belief. Christians will insist on preserving this link. Belief here denotes more than just assent, say, to the Articles of the Creed. Pleading for mercy and singing hosannas are not believing in the sense of assenting to assertions. Belief includes all four dimensions of what Peter calls knowledge, including understanding, experiential acquaintance, and wisdom in practice. All of this is put in jeopardy by performances of the Mass in concert halls, by Protestants no less. For example, the text is integral to the comprehending practice of worship. When the text says, "Lord, have mercy," it is we, the hearers and speakers of the text, who are pleading for mercy on our own behalf and on behalf of our fellow human beings. But this is not so in the concert hall. There the text is being sounded as an object of interested contemplation, but the interest is not in being given mercy and praising God. The text is being performed, not voiced on our behalf. If it is heard as expressing belief, then it's just fine in the concert hall if that belief is somebody else's or the belief of a bygone era. The music is the draw. The concert goers listen to the performance of the text of the Mass because it is set to the music. Could the music be intoned without loss with an alternative set of syllables, ones that make no sense to us? Well, the Latin and Greek texts may be incomprehensible to auditors of the Mass, and so might as well be nonsense syllables. The point for such a concert goer is that the syllables carry the music, not that they bear the meaning of the text. But let's say that for certain concert goers, the text is important. They want the Mass sung in the ancient languages, and they want it to be the text of the Mass. What kind of importance then does it have for such aesthetic listeners? Maybe it is of antiquarian interest. The concert goer wants to have an authentic experience. So it's important that the text be in Latin and Greek, and that it be rooted in the history of the Church. If this describes our concert goer, then the distinction between the aesthetic and the religious that MacIntyre calls blurred is the distinction between two kinds of interest. The concert goer looks to be awed by gorgeous inventiveness, whereas the Mass goer is looking to worship, to ask for mercy, to affirm his beliefs, to thank and glorify God, and intone hosannas. But is there a kind of aesthetic that belongs in the worship service, one that is integral to it, one in which the religious is intrinsically served by the aesthetic, or the aesthetic is itself religious? If there is such an aesthetic, then the distinction that needs to be preserved is not that between the aesthetic and the religious, but that between the non-religious aesthetic and the religious aesthetic. And the liability that the concert program presents is that these two kinds of aesthetic get confused. The person who has accepted the practice of putting the Mass on the concert circuit finds that in church he listens to the Mass with the wrong aesthetic. He listens as though he's in the concert hall rather than in a place of worship. His religious practice has been adulterated by the practice of putting the Mass on the program. The liability to this confusion is especially acute for a setting as gorgeous as Bach's B minor Mass. But it is the very adequacy of Bach's aesthetic to the text, as understood by a believer, that makes the confusion so seductive. She may need to struggle against losing the pathos of the text and the wonderfulness of the music. She may need intentionally to undertake to let the pathos of the music deepen and make more comprehensible the pathos of the text. She may need to call intentionally on her Christian wisdom as she hears the words of the Mass set to Bach's music. Soren Kierkegaard's pseudonym, Judge William, objects to the traditional distinction between the aesthetic and the ethical in his letter called The Aesthetic Validity of Marriage. There he argues that the greatest and deepest and best and most stable aesthetic value is a dimension of the ethical. The aesthete's attempt at a decisive separation of the two spheres ends in aesthetic disaster, a kind of human misery and ugliness. In a moment, I will illustrate this disaster with Michal O'Sheill's treatment of the life and work of Pablo Picasso. The choice between the aesthetic and the ethical orientations to life is an exclusive either-or. That's the name of Kierkegaard's book. You can't live out both worldviews at the same time. But the aesthetic and the ethical, as ways that things can have worth, are not only compatible, but enjoy a kind of necessary interdependence. The life of duty and marital faithfulness, for example, is beautiful. And if in a particular case it seems to be short on beauty and joy, it's because in some way it falls short of the excellences of duty and faithfulness. The integrated conception of the aesthetic seems to be embedded in the psalmist's phrase, the beauty of holiness. The whole of Psalm 96 is a song and an invitation to sing about the glory of God, his righteousness, his holiness, his strength, his truth. It is an artwork designed to attract our attention, to be a reminder of the sort that Peter notes. Glory is an attribute, glory as an attribute is an evident excellence, a radiance of goodness. But what is this radiance of goodness but beauty? In Plato's Phaedrus, Socrates says that among the forms, only that of beauty shines with intense attractiveness and radiance in the world here below. But Socrates also knows that the most important beauty, the highest beauty, for all its radiance, is evident to the apprehension only of the wise. Fools will be blind to it. They can, in their way, see the beauty of a human body, but to them justice and temperance look dull. This is no doubt why Peter insists that our knowledge of God will be ineffectual and unfruitful, short on understanding, if it is not embodied in the virtues that it implies. The virtues enable us to see the beauty of holiness. It is primarily God's moral qualities that Psalm 96 celebrates as glorious. It is in prospect of God's coming judgment that the heavens will rejoice, the earth be glad, the sea roar, and the field exult in joyful song about this glory of the Lord. And it's the people who have been formed in such a way that they can see that glory, that they can see the glory in the holiness. Those people have to be people whose character is formed so as to be able to see that. Let's glance at 3 works of art, just briefly, to indicate how they can supply reminders of God's glory to those with eyes to see and ears to hear. All 3 are large, major works of art, each many-sided and fathomless. In each case, I will pick out a tiny detail or 2 to illustrate my claims. The 3 works are Michal Oshil's The 5 Quintets, Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, and J.S. Bach's The B Minor Mass. Analogy, I'm going to start with the Oshil Picasso. Analogy is a poetic device for conjuring an understanding. In 4 haikus, the poetic voice proposes that Picasso remind us in various ways of a rabbit. He unpredictably and easily changes course. He moves through a maze of hidden networks. He is quick and indiscriminate in his mating practice. He freezes in response to the intense light of truth about himself. The haikus are part of a poetic gestalt, a take on this commanding figure of modern visual art. The other part of the take is the dialogue of 4 sonnets between the poetic voice and that of Picasso. As a unit, these 8 poems present an understanding of Picasso, the man and the artist. The first sonnet depicts Picasso's early years in Paris and notes his rebellion and his Cubist deconstruction, destruction of what is whole and natural. In the second sonnet, Picasso testifies to his endlessly fecund imagination, indifference to any time frame larger than the moment, despite the clamoring whispers of his personal decay, and that despite the mechanizing, skeptical mood of Cubism, he obeyed the naive animal lust of his eye. The third sonnet, in the poet's voice, reproves Picasso for artistic stagnation, aimlessness, and idling self-obsession. In the fourth, Picasso speaks, and it's a sad confession. We start with the attached haiku. I'm going to read this fourth set. Dazzled unawares, caught in too bright a light, a rabbit freezes. And then the sonnet. I searched in my outsider Paris years, when fellow feeling for my demoiselle and passion's conversations with my peers had made me think, although my heart rebelled. Give me élan. For all our cubes achieved, I do not want to search. I want to find. To hell with thought and all things preconceived. I will not work the warren of the mind. Duendes, sparking me, now damn my soul. I crave the favors that my fame now grants and paint the jokes that please and play my role. Have I become a king of sycophants? Enclosed in both my fortune and acclaim, I can't outgrow the icon I became. I've already commented about the biblical emphasis on thinking, on setting our minds on important things and not setting them on corrupting things, and the way in which doing so is crucial to our development as persons. Picasso's confession may remind us of this biblical theme. He seems to confess that his marginal Paris friends were thinking through the questions of life, even occasioned by his own famous painting, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, and drew him in for a while. But such inquiry was not for him. This little bunny will not work the warren of the mind. Vital spontaneity, living thoughtlessly in the moment, bursting with creative impulse, going with the sensual flow, that would be his way. the contraries of all those constancies that, according to St. Peter, make our knowledge of God effective and fruitful, enabling us to participate in the divine nature and protecting us from the corruptions of the world we live in. But now the price: a soul forfeited, frozen desperately in the confusing dazzle of dawning self-awareness. Not the vaunted freedom of the aesthetic life, but a self-made prison. The beauty of Alyosha. We see Alyosha's holiness, and with a little foothold in wisdom, we may appreciate its beauty in various scenes. In his tender love for the crippled girl Lisa, in his astonished chastity when the beautiful and naughty Grushenka leaps onto his lap, in his sorrow at the death of Father Zosima, in his sad, attentive listening as his atheist brother Ivan expounds in gruesome detail the evil in the world, in his interaction with the schoolboys, especially his facilitation of their compassionate reconciliation with Ilyusha. Book 2 narrates a visit to the local monastery and its elder, Zosima, by several men, including the Karamazov brothers and their father. A purpose of the story is to illustrate the father's almost psychopathic character. Fyodor Pavlovich seems to enjoy nothing more than embarrassing and annoying those around him, and to this end is more than willing to advertise his own depravity and foolishness. But the narrator tells us that this old reprobate, whose brazen armor seems impenetrable, would be driven by night fears of a spiritual nature to wake his servant Grigori, a man of deep, if rigid, virtue, asking him to come. When the old man came, Fyodor Pavlovich would begin talking about the most trivial matters and would soon let him go again, sometimes even with a jest. And after he had gone, Fyodor Pavlovich would get into bed with a curse and sleep the sleep of the just. Something of the same sort happened to Fyodor Pavlovich on Alyosha's arrival. Alyosha pierced his heart, as he said, by living with him, seeing everything and blaming nothing. Moreover, Alyosha brought with him something his father had never known before, a complete absence of contempt for him and an invariable kindness, a perfectly natural, unaffected devotion to the old man who deserved it so little. All this was a complete surprise to the old profligate, who had dropped all family ties. It was a new and surprising experience for him, who had till then loved nothing but what he called evil. After Alyosha's departure, he confessed himself that he now understood something he had hitherto been reluctant to understand. What do you suppose Fyodor Pavlovich understands that he didn't understand before Alyosha came by? I think he understands that real love is possible. He glimpses, at least, that the kinds of invidious enjoyment that have been typical for him are not the only or the best ones possible. And the kinds of relationship with others that he has supposed to be normal are perhaps not so normal after all. Surprisingly, at least there's another possibility. His understanding bears a distant similarity to penitence. The reprobate goes on and on about his love for Alyosha. And what piece of Christian knowledge does this little moment in Dostoevsky's artwork call to mind? It reminds me, at least, that even the most benumbed heart, say that of a Pablo Picasso or a Donald Trump, may be accessible to and improvable by an encounter with purity of heart. There may be in that depraved heart a little hidden window through which an indisputable instance of holiness can gleam, a secret sensitive spot that may tingle in response to a loving touch. And lastly, a sequence in Bach's B minor Mass. The, the infinite combinations of pitches, length of note duration, temporal spacing, loudness, melodic lines, and so forth yield infinite variations in what we might call musical character. Each chord, each melody, each counterpoint, each rhythmic pattern has its own character and lends a special character to the larger sequences produced by combining these into phrases, sections, movements, and works. A notable kind of character of passages and pieces of music is the affective character. That is to say, music is suggestive of emotion. Pieces can be joyful, cheerful, jubilant, sorrowful, mournful, angry, strident, serene, confident, anxious, agitated, comical, mysterious, and so forth. And in this way, music, by reminding us, by giving us this impression of some kind of emotional mood or affect, the music can remind us of features of stories that to which those affects are appropriate. Bach's B minor Mass refers to such stories in the movements that are settings of the clauses of the Nicene Creed. The settings have the emotional character that befits the clauses they set. In this way, for a believing listener who pays attention to the text, the musical setting may enhance the understanding of the text by reminding him of the appropriate emotional response and may actually encourage that response to this part of the story. He may appreciate better the sadness or joyfulness of the clause in the creed because of its musical setting. Okay. Now I'm going to the movements that I'm going to look at are the first one is and was incarnate by the Holy Spirit of the Virgin Mary and was made man. Of this movement, George Stauffer notes that the opening instrumental figure not only outlines in advance the general shape of the vocal theme, but establishes the affect of the entire movement, an affect of mystery and wonder. This clause and this clause and its biblical background will be the believer's object of attention as in this moment of the Mass, as his ears are bathed in the sound of the instruments and the voices. The believer will feel the mystery and wonder that is proper to the understanding of his knowledge that God became incarnate in Jesus. So now let's listen to, let's see, okay, yeah, we're going to listen to this movement. Oh, dear. Well, maybe we're not going to listen to it. Yeah, I do. Sure do. Okay, what are you trying to do here?
Oh,
So,
goodness, okay.
those are the movements.
And the mic, yeah, the mic. Okay, let's see.
Okay, so maybe I needed to click on this. Yeah, there you go.
Buffering. Goodness. Okay, this is Apple Music. Oh my. just doesn't want to play. Oh dear.
Okay, I guess we'll just
Sorry.
have to. Okay, you just have to believe me. Yeah. So there these three movements. The one movement is about the incarnation, God and Jesus. The second person of the Trinity was made man. The second one is about the crucifixion and laying in the tomb. The third one is about the resurrection. And I just commend these pieces of music to you. Listen to them when you can. Each of them, well, the second one, for example, about the crucifixion, has a melodic movement that's a sort of a downward movement, which duplicates, I think, funereal wailing. So there's a sound something like, oh, oh, that's reproduced by the music, and it repeats through the thing. And then the third movement on the resurrection is like a jig. It's at a very rapid pace. It's in a major key. It's there are lots of trumpets blowing and so forth, and it's just joyful. It's like a dance, like a jig. Okay, that's the end of my talk. Sorry about what a miserable ending. Yeah, right.
I was very interested in your comments about the different contexts of performing mass compositions, either in a concert context or spiritual context. And I was reminded of the great evangelical power of beauty and how in the last 40 years or so there's a huge movement of appreciation for Bach's music in Japan, and how there's an estimated tens of thousands of people being converted to Christianity as a result of that music. Yeah, so so the phrase, the evangelical power of beauty, and I'm reminded of how a movement in Japan for the appreciation of Bach's music, people come for the Bach, but they leave believing the gospel, and there's an estimated some tens of thousands of conversions to Christianity as a result of that. So I'm wondering if this isn't quite a thought so much as a comment, but I'll try to turn it into a question. Do you have thoughts on the evangelical power of beauty in relation to what you've been speaking about today?
You mean by the evangelical power of beauty the attractiveness of artworks that then draw the people into believing. Yeah. Well, another aspect of the reminder, you might say, of the reminding power of art is that much art is beautiful. And if the Christian knows that the most beautiful thing of all is God, right? And so every artwork, whether it's explicitly Christian or whether it has a text or whichever, would be a reminder of the beauty of God. I think that's a theme that could be developed, certainly.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time, so please join me in thanking Dr. Roberts. So our next speaker is Dr. Thomas Ward, also of Baylor University's Philosophy Department. Dr. Ward has completed degrees from both Oxford and UCLA, among other institutions. Prior to Biola, he taught at Loyola Marymount University. He has two recent books, one called Divine Ideas by Cambridge University Press, which came out in 2020, and his most recently completed work is called Ordered by Love, which is an introduction to Duns Scotus. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Tom Ward. Oh yes, and the title of his talk is The Intelligible Medium, God's Creativity in the Divine Ideas Tradition.
Thanks, Charity. I had some critical things about Picasso that I cut out of the talk. I could have left them in. I was afraid of offending, but after what's been said, it wouldn't have been that bad. Well, this talk is about the theory of divine ideas, which is a traditional way, at least in theology, of making sense of the doctrine of creation. The heart of the doctrine of creation is that the existence of the world is due to a divine and therefore personal action. Thinking and loving stand at the back of all things. The theory of divine ideas holds that God has ideas of all the creatures he could create. Indeed, has ideas of whole worlds of creatures he could create. And his actual creation of a world is sort of like an artist who, inspired by an idea of a painting she would like to paint, paints it. However, unlike the human artist who has to reach outside herself to gather the stock of ideas on which her creativity depends, God has his ideas just from himself. Divine ideas are exemplars of God's creatures, and God himself is the exemplar of his ideas of creatures. God is the only totally original artist. The theory of divine ideas is very old. Its classical expression is an artifact of the meeting of worlds or worldviews. On the one hand, Greek philosophy with its Platonic forms, and on the other, Jewish theology with its monotheistic doctrine of creation. Greek philosophical influence on Jewish thought probably began as early as the 3rd century BC, when the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek. But hints of a theory of divine ideas are to be found translated into Greek in the Septuagint. The hints of a theory of divine ideas are to be found scattered in the Septuagint, and especially in its apocryphal books, in which God's word, logos, or wisdom, Sophia, are personified as the agents of creation. But the standard narrative, with which I'm sure most of us are familiar, credits a later source, the Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria, with the first explicit synthesis of Jewish creation and Platonism. Plato had envisioned a non-spatio-temporal realm of forms, which are the exemplars of sensible things here below, the true realities which the things of this world but dimly reflect. Philo reimagined these forms as God's ideas or words, the exemplars by which God creates the heavens and earth. And it is hard to overstate the influence of this basic picture on subsequent philosophical theology and the Abrahamic traditions, and especially in Christianity. But there is nothing originally Greek or Jewish in this core idea of one God who creates everything besides himself by means of his thoughts. Probably not by their oldest 3rd millennium theologies, but still long, long ago, Egyptian religious thinkers had conceived of creation as the intellectual product of a single God. Akhenaten, the famous 14th century monotheist, composed a great hymn to his god Aten, which teaches the doctrine of creation ex nihilo and bears more than a superficial resemblance to Psalm 104. A text from the 13th century features the god Ta, who conceives other gods and the created world in his heart, and then speaks them into being with his tongue, unaided by any primordial elements. And yet another text from the 13th century speculates that all the gods' identities are hidden in Amun. The sun is his face, Ta is his body, and everything comes from the mouth of Amun. Just one among many examples of the Egyptian theological penchant for unifying their many gods. Babylonian authors did not care very much about their original creator gods, Tiamat and Apsu. They cared far more about gods who were present, active in world affairs. But here too we find a sort of convergence of many gods upon one God. Like Ta or Amun, one God who has the power, if not to create, then simply to be all the other gods. Thus, in the 3rd millennium epic Enema Elish, when Marduk establishes order in the world by his heroic deeds, the 50 great gods take their seats and praise Marduk with 50 names. In a later text, probably from the 15th century or earlier, other gods appear to be no longer merely deferential to Marduk. Instead, they are identified with him, one God making shift for many. If Egyptian metaphysical speculation converged upon a single divine origin of all, Babylonian religious devotion converged upon a single divine object of worship. The Hebrew Bible engages these and other ancient theologies in several ways. It combines the Babylonian theme of heroic divine agency with the Egyptian impulse to adore the first principle of all things. It tells the story of the Israelites sometimes trying, frequently failing, to reject foreign gods in favor of the exclusive worship of the one God. But it is also a proclamation that God, the Lord, on his own, does divinity better than any pantheon and better than any chief of a pantheon, and is therefore entitled to exclusive worship. He assumes all the qualities of the gods who were his rivals for the allegiance of his chosen people, and even takes the name of El, patriarch of the Canaanite pantheon. One side of this sole allegiance to God is entirely negative. You shall have no other gods but the Lord. The altars of Baal and the fertility poles of Asherah must be torn down and must never be erected again. This negativity eventually takes the ultimate form of denial that such rivals even exist. You must carry your idols, says God, but I will carry you. Isaiah 46:1. Whatever divine beings or members of the heavenly host there really are, those who, for example, shout for joy when God establishes the heavens, Job 38, are his creatures, angels if you like, not to be worshipped as gods. But there is a positive side to this sole allegiance, which is that the one God fulfills everything worth seeking in rival gods. Like Marduk, the Lord God assumes all divine qualities worth having. The benefit of being a God who can hide himself, Isaiah 45:15, and a God of which there must be no graven image, Deuteronomy 4:15-19, is that he can reveal himself nearly any way he likes. God has just one true name, but it is as capacious as can be. God will be whatever he needs to be to accomplish his purposes. A still small voice for Elijah, but a whirlwind for Job. Like Marduk and Baal, he is a warrior to whom the sea monster is but a fish which God draws forth from the waters for sport. Like Ta, he is the architect and engineer of the world, establishing order, Job 38:4-6. Like Baal, he is the god of weather, Psalm 18:6-15. Amun-Re and Aten have been eclipsed by the sun, which is the Lord, Psalm 84:11. the Son who makes the sun and everything else, Psalm 104:19. He is a husband who cares for his people, Isaiah 54:5, and they are bride enough for him. He needs no goddess to be his consort, Hosea 2:21. But anything you might want in a goddess is already in God. He is a fierce mama bear, Hosea 13:8, a comforting mother, Isaiah 66:13, the one who gave birth to you, Deuteronomy 32:18. If zoology is your thing, God is, in addition to a bear, a lion, Isaiah 38:13, a leopard, Hosea 13:7, a bull, Numbers 24:8, and depending on your view about what it would take for someone to be the Messiah, a lamb. The Hebrew Bible is not a record of the first monotheism or the first doctrine of creation ex nihilo, or even the first inkling of the theory of divine ideas. That title goes to whomever wrote that bit about Ptah, thinking up the whole world in his heart. But it records a monotheism, the one God of which is so busy, so complicated, so rich, that it feels hardly innovative to say, in Greek terms, that this one God contains in himself the intelligible principles of everything that can be. Having read the Bible, what else would we expect of God? The biblical God is just the right sort of God to feature in a theory of divine ideas. The theory says that God already has in himself, prior to creation, whatever is intelligible about creation. And this is why the theory finds its theological home in the doctrine of creation. It's a way of explaining God's rationality in creating the world. It makes God the unique first principle of all, makes his creative activity intelligible and purposeful, and thereby makes his world the product of a mind and so able to be investigated rationally. God is not only powerful enough to cause the existence of the world, but he is personal, with the powers distinctive of a person, and a person with the best sort of character. But if God is personal, then his if God is personal, then his actions are personal actions. And this means they are intentional and free. And if such a God is perfect in character, then his actions are rational and good. These guideposts for reflection on the doctrine of creation force us to think of God as knowing what he is doing when he creates. When he says, for example, "Let there be light," he does not discover what light is when it comes into existence. He meant light. And if he meant it, then he knew about light before he spoke it into being. The precise sense of before is, of course, difficult to pin down. Minimally, it is an explanatory or logical before. If the world is a product of God's rational action, then when God makes light, he makes it in part because he knows about light, as when we say that the child aced the test because she knew her multiplication table. Knowing about light is part of the explanation of making light. And I mean before, just in that minimal sense of being part of an explanation. So God has things in mind and has creatures, possible creatures, in mind before he creates anything. It is important to emphasize the similarity between God's having things in mind and our having things in mind in order to preserve the coherence of thinking of God as personal. But naturally, there are important differences between the way God has things in mind and the way we do. Most importantly, for our purposes, God is totally original, and no human being, even the most creative human artist, is totally original. Creative as she is, there are at least two ways in which the human artist cannot be totally original. First, to make, say, a painting, she requires some medium, canvas and paint. The quality of the painting will be determined not just by the skill and care of the artist, but also partially determined by the nature of the medium itself. Good paint and canvas make for better paintings than bad paint and canvas, all else being equal. Second, while the idea of the painting might itself be a novel assemblage of simpler ideas, never thought up by any other human artist, the mind of the artist must be shaped by her interaction with the world, observing it with her senses, sharing it with human communities, to achieve that medium of concepts or language, habits or skills required for thinking up the idea of the painting. So we might say that the painting depends on a material medium, and that coming up with the idea of the painting depends on an intelligible medium. Theologians within the divine ideas tradition hold that God's creativity is independent of both media. God creates the world ex nihilo, that is, from no material thing which exists prior to God's creation of the world. So God depends on no material medium. He makes the paint and canvas he needs to make his painting. Moreover, God himself is sufficiently rich in intelligible content that God gets his very idea of the world he intends to create from no other source but himself. Thus, God depends on no intelligible medium. He does not look abroad to other worlds or realms or gods to discover what sorts of things he might make. If this is right, then God indeed is totally, doubly original. He is the one origin of the material of the world, along with the intelligible structure which a material world can exemplify. He is the sole ultimate source of intelligibility. God contains multitudes, more even than Walt Whitman. Whatever exists, whatever can exist, any possible way that things can be is because God is what God is. God has ideas of all the ways that things can be, and he gets all these ideas just by thinking about himself. So the spirit of this talk may therefore be thought of as a complement to the Ignatian exhortation to find God in all things. I hope we will find all things in God. If we do, we will see that there is nothing truly secular. Everything is sacred. The sense of secular I have in mind here is a semi-technical sense, which comes from Brian Leftow's monumental 2015 book, God and Necessity. Consider a necessary truth about something which might not seem at first to have anything to do with God. Water is H2O. On the divine ideas view, this truth, despite at first seeming like it doesn't have much to do with God, is, so to speak, encoded in what it is to be God. There is indeed, on the divine ideas view, something divine about water and its chemical composition. But Leftow wants to make this and similar secular truths depend as much as possible on God's contingent activity, not encoded in what it is to be God, and so thought of by God as part of God's perfect self-knowledge, but simply dependent on God as made or made up by God. So on his view, there is nothing divine about water except that God invented it. Now, Leftow's motivation is pious. He wishes to preserve what he calls divine ultimacy. God's being the sole ultimate reality. And I share this pious motivation. But Leftow has a deep intuition that there is something wrong with making secular truths encoded in what it is to be God. The truth that water is H2O is commonly taken to be a necessary truth. Whatever else it means to be a necessary truth, it means that not even God could make it false or untrue that water is H2O. I mean, he could make it the case that there never existed water. He could make it the case that all the water that currently exists is annihilated and ceases to exist, but can't change, so to speak, the essence of water. Water is H2O. So not even God could make it untrue that water is H2O. Now this bothers Leftow. Consider that the view I endorse, according to which God's essence is the source of everything intelligible, entails that if God exists, then water is H2O. This is because God's own essence is the ultimate reason why it is true that water is H2O. But then it follows that if it is not the case that water is H2O, then God does not exist. Now, Leftow, that example is from Leftow, and he thinks that it is necessary that water is H2O. So his concern here is not that chemists might discover they were wrong about the chemical composition of water and thereby zap God out of existence. Instead, the concern is that God's existence just shouldn't be wrapped up in any way with secular things. But the conditional that if it is not the case that water is H2O, then God does not exist, sure looks like God's existence depends in some sense on the nature of water. But since the chemical composition of water is a purely secular fact, it should be irrelevant to God being what God is. So then Leftow makes the nature of water in some important sense up to God, God's willing, a product of God's contingent willing and thinking, not entailed by his thinking about his own nature. And in doing so, he manages to divorce God's nature from the creaturely realm and preserve God's ultimacy, which is exactly what he wanted to do. While I share Leftow's motivation for divine ultimacy, I do not share his intuition that secular truths, even necessary secular truths, threaten divine ultimacy. And so a better way to put this is that I deny that there are secular truths. Water is pretty important in Christian theology. Baptism requires water. Water flowed with blood from the side of the crucified Christ. And there is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy habitation of the Most High. On my view, water is expressive of what God is. Everything is expressive of what God is. And we grasp very little of all this, and we grasp less through discursive methods than through poetic and contemplative methods. But our poor ability to access the distinctive divine expression of each creature is no cause for skepticism about the divine exemplar of each creature. If God is to each creature as exemplar to image, then Leftow's concern about water just dries up. It's not a secular truth. Yeah, you like that. Thank you. I'm honored. That there are no secular truths should matter a great deal to us. We inhabit a world inescapably divine. Of course, this does not mean that the world is God or God's body. It means merely that everything in the world resembles its divine archetype. The world is God's artwork, and it is inescapably representational artwork. The problem with representational artworks, I mean those made by humans, is that they tempt us to think that they represent the world as it is, when of course they can only represent the world as it is to us. Things must always mean more than they seem, for things, insofar as they manifest God's own thoughts and God's own nature, have, in George MacDonald's words, layer upon layer of ascending significance. It is no skepticism to admit our limitations. We only see from one perspective at a time. We cannot really even so much as picture to ourselves, seeing from all perspectives at once, a single object seen simultaneously from 360 degrees. Braque and Picasso in their Cubist phases tried, but they could not succeed. This is why Cubist paintings look so weird and ugly. But I doubt God finds things so weird and ugly when he sees them as the Cubists tried to see them. The attempt to gain a God's eye view severs us from the only means we have to make sense of the world, however little sense that might be. But the theory of divine ideas helps us see that there really is nothing new under the sun, even in art. Not because the sun has been around so long, but because everything under the sun represents the eternal God who is beyond the stars. Small and happy people like me can enjoy artworks, even art which is obvious, because we know our place in the cosmos, one line of sight at a time, and what a sight to see. But art, which is not at all obvious to me, is obvious to God, and this is sometimes a problem for ambitious artists. We cannot really move beyond representation in art, though of course many have tried. Recognizing the divine artistry behind all things helps make some sense out of a common human experience, a sense of seeing things as signs, as pointing beyond themselves to some other less accessible reality. Because we can never know everything God meant in creation, we ought to be open to the discovery or revelation of layer upon layer of ascending significance in every creature. An openness on display when Joanna Newsom sings, "There are some mornings when the sky feels like a road." Or when Brandi Carlile sings of the time when the midnight moon shines so bright, nearly pulled us up to heaven by the strings of our heart. What we love when we love a thing which is not God is both that thing and God, or that aspect of God which that creature specially resembles. Every bush, a burning bush, if we have eyes to see. Samuel Taylor Coleridge eventually came to see that he was wrong when he wrote that we receive but what we give, and in our life alone does nature live. He was wrong because we receive only what God gives, and so by means of nature we get a glimpse of God. But Coleridge was right to recognize that the world is, after all, essentially implicated in what it is to be personal. For what it does to us, or at least to so many of us, is to make us think that it's whispering secret things about itself and about something beyond itself. If you become convinced it is not disclosing divine things, then you must explain away the whispers. Coleridge's response was to conclude, for a time anyway, that he himself was the only mind which spoke through nature, and, well, this dejected him. Eventually, he would find peace, sort of, by embracing Christianity, which taught him to see our own representations of the world as a repetition in the finite mind of the eternal act of creation in the infinite I am. But ultimately, the whispers of roses and yew trees and waterfalls are not enough, because these things are not articulate enough about divine things to be our Savior. Or perhaps they just cannot say enough about divine things in a language we can understand. The incarnation of the Logos might be understood then as the act which translates their meaning, a translation performed by the author himself, ensuring the significance of creatures, or perhaps reminding us of the significance of creatures, their ability to signify. This religious significance of all creatures is neatly correlated with the monotheistic impulse against idols. It would be a mean thing for God to demand all our love in a way that required total indifference to or rejection of our creaturely attachments. We were not made to bear that sort of spiritual burden. But if every creature is a little theophany, even then the religious life is not a matter of transferring our love from creatures to God, but ordering our love of creatures toward our love of God. And this matters not only for ethics, but eschatology, an ever-deepening revelation of God in created things asymptotically approaches vision of the divine essence itself, keeping continuity always between the loves we never truly leave behind and the love which is our final end. After Narnia, New Narnia, therefore closer to the lion. A religious monotheist, a Christian in particular, should therefore welcome a theory which, if true, made good sense out of the religious sensibilities that God is to be loved above all, but that all things may also be loved because they may be found in God. Thanks.
Well, thank you. We have a little bit of time for Q&A, so just raise your hand and I will bring the mic your direction.
Thank you for the talk. That was beautiful. I have a question about this idea that everything is then sacred if it's all in the mind of God. I had a conversation with a friend a while ago who was also kind of arguing along these lines, and I kind of pushed him to a sort of reductio ad absurdum where he basically admitted that he thought that the Eucharist could be as supernaturally efficacious as eating a piece of chocolate cake. Which, seems off intuitively. So I love the idea that everything is sacred, but then I wonder, what do we do then with the idea of sacred space versus non-sacred space, or liturgy versus secular existence? And I think you kind of got at an answer gesturing in this direction when you're talking about maybe it's just the case that natural realities just aren't enough, or we can't understand them. But I was wondering if you could elaborate on that in regard to sacred versus non-sacred spaces.
Yeah, I share your conviction that however good the chocolate cake is, it's not. Yeah, so this isn't meant to be a kind of romantic or transcendentalist replacement of organized religion, of the sort of specifically religious activities that make up the Christian life, and especially not a replacement of the sacraments themselves. So in the case of incarnation, we have a human nature which itself, just by virtue of what it is, independent of its unity with the Logos, already has this imaging relationship to its divine exemplar. And so we all have that image. But of course, there's something better that happens at incarnation, because then the one person who has that human nature is God, and so we can worship that very human being without idolatry because of that relationship of hypostatic unity. And there is not the right kind of relationship of any other creature to God to make it a fitting object of worship, with the exception for Catholics of the Eucharistic host, where adoration is licit. So I think that's the main thing. And then why have specifically religious practices like prayer and going to church, etc.? I think there, I like this idea of a reminder that Dr. Roberts was talking about, that natural things, whatever sort of uncanny experience you might have, whatever sort of intimations you might be wondering are there, in order for this not to result in a kind of in order to remain an Orthodox Christian, you have to have that language translated. It has to be directed somehow, so that it's not just a kind of religious feeling, but actually has theological content. And so that's where I would mark the difference, or the reason for holding on to specifically religious activity. Is this helpful?
Hi. Thank you very much. I'm going to see if I can hold all this together in my mind and make a very concise question. Cardinal Ratzinger's book, Introduction to Christianity, there's a section there where he says, the revelation that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is also the God of mathematics and the universal God of the philosophers, rankles at the beginning. How could the God of the abstract universals be the God of this tribe on this dirtball planet in the far end of the Milky Way galaxy? And he says something like, if we were God, it makes no sense. But of course it makes sense to God because God can see that we matter in the way that he thinks we matter. And I wonder if, while all things reflect God and are in God, and so that way, in that sense, they're all sacred, if something's gone wrong with idolatry, when we're trying to put the mind of God on it, it's like what you said with the lines of sight. We have too many lines of sight together, and we don't know how to do that properly. I'm wondering if you could say something about that. So the way Ratzinger puts it, I don't see how I could be God, because if I were in charge of the universe, to put it, bluntly, I couldn't care about Earth. I couldn't care about every hair on your head. I can't do that. God can. And I wonder if there's something about when we're trying to do this everything sacred thing, we can't do it. We don't know how to do that because we're not God.
Yeah, I remember as a college student hearing a talk, and the Professor Jeffrey, maybe you can remind me, or correct me if I'm wrong. I think it was Chesterton talking about William Blake, saying that he was the sort of man who could see a halo around every flower. Is that right? Yeah. And that really captivated me as a teenager. I thought, wow, I'd really like to be able to do that. And I asked the speaker, so how does one go about learning how to see like that? And he said, well, Chesterton and William Blake were really smart. And so I was dejected. So I don't know, that wasn't that long ago. I mean, I just turned 40, so it's half a lifetime for me. I think I've made some progress, but I'm still learning. Yeah, it's hard. Like it's hard to see that way, but I don't think it's impossible. And I guess it's a kind of training of one's vision and character.
have
So
time.
since God doesn't have to go through training, it would be pretty easy for him. It's really hard for us.
I think we have time for one more question.
Just following up on that, I grew up in evangelical circles, and when I went into the Rocky Mountains, I was surprised that other evangelicals weren't as kind of absorbed by the beauty of nature and so forth as all kinds of secular people, and I've puzzled about this for a long time. And I guess one thing that, and tying into the first question, has to do with a sacramental view of reality. And I think, Catholics and Orthodox seem, because of this sacramental vision that's available to them, to have, like I think of Gerard Manley Hopkins seeing in the wind over the hawk descending and having just this incredible sacramental vision of reality that somehow seeing the world as God's world and holy and everything as holy, maybe as Protestants, or those of us who are Protestants, don't have quite the resources theologically because we don't really have a strong emphasis on the sacraments.
That might be true, like historically, that the evangelicals haven't, in fact, drawn on what resources are there. But there's no reason why an evangelical can't appropriate Maximus the Confessor, or Pseudo-Dionysius, or Saint Anselm, or Bonaventure, or Aquinas. These great thinkers are as much a part of their Christian past as it is of the Christian past of Catholics and Orthodox, even if Catholics and Orthodox might recognize more in common with medieval and patristic authors than evangelicals would. So I think the resources are there, and the divine ideas way of sort of thinking about creation is, again, I think available to everyone. You mentioned your evangelical friends who were unmoved by the beauty of nature. I mean, suppose you thought that creation is a gift from God to human beings, in the sense that it's like the resources that we need to live. And so God has provided this world for us. And then you might be grateful to God for the world, but that way of thinking about creation wouldn't inspire you to see it as holy. It's just resources. I think it's open to the evangelical, as any other Christian, to see it as more than resources or sustenance. And in particular, when you focus on what I think of as the rationality of God's creation. God knows what he's doing before he creates. Where does he get all these ideas? He doesn't go to a celestial IKEA to figure out what kind of furniture is available to stock his world. It's something intrinsic to what God himself is that provides God with whatever intelligibility is there on the basis of which to create a world. And that rather simple thought ramifies into this whole way of thinking about the whole natural world as expressive of divinity. And of course, there are ways that you could go too far with it. Some people become pantheists, like Eriugena. I think Maximus sometimes verges toward pantheism, but you don't have to go that way and still hold on to what I think of as the wisdom of this divine ideas tradition.